Located in Boston's famous North End, a United States industrial alcohol storage tank shook and rumbled before exploding, flooding the streets in a deluge of hot molasses. The wave left a wake of destruction in its path, turning buildings to scraps, injuring 150 and killing 21. The day was January 15, 1919, and the country stood on the precipice of ratifying the 18th Amendment, which would put prohibition into effect, effectively outlawing the production and sale of alcohol. Section 1 of the 18th Amendment states, "After 1 year from the ratification of this article, the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors within, the importation thereof into, or the exportation thereof from the United States and all territory subject to the jurisdiction thereof for beverage purposes is hereby prohibited." Alcohol's legality was put on a clock, and as such, demand for alcohol surged during the last year of its availability. With it came a surge in demand for molasses, a common ingredient in alcoholic drinks like rum and industrial alcohol. Some speculate that the imminence of prohibition pressured the USIA into overfilling the already fragile tank. In their greed, the USIA prioritized cash over safety in order to make a large profit while they still could, walking headfirst into disaster.
Even though fear of prohibition was a significant cause, it was not the only cause of the tank's eventual collapse. Arthur Gell, the USIA's treasurer, neglected basic safety tests during the construction of the tank. For example, Gell did not fill the tank with water to check for leaks, and he also ignored groaning sounds each time the tank was filled. Gell actually had the tank painted brown in order to cover up leaked molasses. In addition to Gell's lack of safety precautions, the tank's walls were not as thick as they should have been to withstand the force of the molasses. According to a 2015 study by Peter Schwarm, in which he applied modern engineering analysis, the tank's walls were actually half as thick as they should have been for a tank of that size. Molasses has a density of 1.4 gram per milliliter, whereas water has a density of 1.0 gram per milliliter. The higher density of molasses led to a higher outward pressure. Additionally, the temperature rose from 2 to 41 degrees Fahrenheit the previous day, raising the internal gas pressure significantly. In a well-constructed tank, external temperatures would not affect internal pressure buildup. However, the molasses tank had a fatigue crack that allowed the outside heat to slip in. The tank's walls also lacked manganese, leading them to be much more brittle.
This is Stefan Puelo, author of The Dark Tide.
Basically collapsed as a result of shoddy construction and poor materials. The steel that was delivered to support the tank, to build the tank, was much thinner than original specifications called for. And when it was put together with thousands of rivets, and it was done in a very rushed manner, and it was not put together well at all. There was no inspection, there was no clerk of the works as we would know a clerk of the works today. The project was overseen by a person who had no technical experience, no architectural experience, and no engineering experience of any kind.
With all of these factors, the molasses tank was destined to collapse.
The 40-foot wave traveled at a speed of 35 miles per hour, racking up a casualty count of 21 dead and 150 injured. It traveled from the location of the tank on Commercial Street throughout the North End, all while collapsing buildings and trapping civilians. The wave of molasses struck with little to no warning. This left nearby pedestrians and workers vulnerable to the disaster. Robert Burnett, a citizen living in Boston during the time period, was eating dinner when the flood struck. He recalls, "I looked out the window and saw this great black wave coming. It seemed like the side of a mountain falling into space. Of course, it came quickly. Then it poured molasses." The wave destroyed many nearby structures, including the elevated railway. In addition to the collapse of many important structures, the molasses hardened as it cooled, engulfing civilians, leaving them helpless to escape. In the following days, the community came together to help save the victims. Firefighters attempted to wash away the thigh-deep molasses with the municipal water supply. In addition, sailors attempted to mop up the sticky liquid with sand. Neither method was successful. forcing the Boston Fire Department to look for additional methods to clean the sludge. Eventually, they turned to the water in the Boston Harbor. The salinity of the water helped wash away the molasses better than the fresh water. The cleanup process was extremely long and challenging. Crews of men were assigned groups of people that were reported missing. The group slowly uncovered bodies that were stuck beneath the molasses. Many victims were unrecognizable, completely glazed in molasses. One victim was not discovered until he washed ashore at the harbor months later. The rescuers were faced with constant calls and messages from loved ones looking for missing persons. As the bodies were uncovered, the death toll rose. The cleanup effort took more than just water. Large hydraulic scoops were required to remove the molasses from some hard-to-reach areas, such as basements. In addition to the task of cleaning up the thick molasses, the collapsed tank remained mostly intact and had to be deconstructed by metal workers. Finally, the elevated railway that had partially collapsed needed to be reconstructed. In total, it took over 6 months for the area to return to its previous state. These damages do not account for the harm to the environment. The molasses tank was located close to the harbor, resulting in a significant amount of the molasses spilling into and contaminating the water.
Although there are few records of the environmental impact of the Boston Harbor spill, a similar disaster took place in Hawaii in 2013 when an underwater molasses pipe exploded, releasing 233,000 gallons of molasses into Honolulu Harbor. The molasses was a feasting ground for bacteria, allowing them to grow and reproduce quickly and in large numbers. The bacterial growth drew oxygen out of the environment, causing local wildlife to suffocate. Dead fish floated to the surface, and a scuba diver documented the devastated harbor floor littered with crab and fish corpses. Unlike an oil spill, molasses mixes with water, dissolving slowly and then eventually diluting. However, the molasses cannot be removed, and in both spills, molasses turned the water brown for months. Although the cold climate of a Boston January likely decreased bacterial impact, the Boston spill was approximately 10 times as large as the 2013 Honolulu spill and must have had a similarly large, if not larger, impact on the environment. A precursor to the oil spills that would follow in the late 20th century, the Boston molasses flood also inspired regulatory legislation on a local level. Local residents filed a class action lawsuit against the USIA, and despite the company's claims that the tank had been compromised by anti-American terrorists, the USIA was eventually found accountable after retiring 3 years of hearings, which led to new legislation requiring oversight by engineers. Now, in 2019, the tank area is occupied by a recreational park, which includes a plaque in remembrance of the disaster. 100 years later, the molasses flood has become somewhat of a local legend, even having a duck boat named after it, the Molly Molasses. Some say that in hot summer days, you can still smell molasses in the streets.